Have you ever wondered how far the Romans would go to punish those who shattered the sacred bonds of family? Picture this, a crime so unthinkable, parricide, that the state devised a punishment as horrifying as the act itself. They called it the pena culiae, the penalty of the sack. After a brutal scourging, the condemned were sewn into a massive leather bag alongside a snarling dog, a frantic rooster, a writhing snake, and a terrified monkey, creatures chosen to symbolize the chaos of killing one's own blood. Sealed tight, the living tomb was cast into the river, turning justice into a nightmarish symbol of reverse birth, erasing the offender from the world. Punishment number 1. Pena culiae, the sack of horror. In the shadowy alleys of ancient Rome, where politics and bloodlines meant everything, there existed a punishment so disturbing, so symbolically grotesque, that even hardened Roman citizens murmured its name with a shiver. It was called pena culiae, the penalty of the sack. But don't let the simplicity of the name fool you. This wasn't just an execution. It was a living nightmare wrapped in leather and sewn shut by the law. Let's imagine the scene. A Roman citizen, perhaps a young man, perhaps a woman, is convicted of the ultimate betrayal, parricide, the murder of one's own father, mother, or closest kin. In the Roman world, this wasn't just a crime, it was a cosmic sin. It struck at the core of Roman identity, where the paterfamilias, the family father, was as close to a god as any mortal could be. Killing him didn't just end a life. It shattered the universe. Now justice had to respond, and Rome never did things halfway. First came the scourging. The condemned was stripped and whipped mercilessly in public, their skin torn apart not just to punish, but to humiliate. The crowd watched as if the pain would somehow restore balance. But that was only the beginning. Next, the Roman officials brought out the sack, a massive coarse leather sack, stitched thick and wide enough to hold something more than just a body. Because the condemned wasn't going in alone. One by one, the animals arrived. A snarling dog, its eyes flashing with wild anger. A panicked rooster, flapping and screeching. A slithering snake, coiled and venomous. And finally, a monkey, jittery and shrieking, a grotesque parody of human form. These weren't random animals. They each had meaning. The dog was betrayal. The rooster, the soul's restless guilt. The snake, treachery in the dark. The monkey, a twisted mirror of what the condemned once was, human, but no longer. Then all were shoved into the sack together. Limbs tangled, claws scraped, teeth snapped, wings flapped in terror. And when the leather flap closed and the sack was stitched shut, you could still hear the chaos inside. Muffled screams, hisses, flaps, and the frenzied roll of a man realizing he would die not by blade or flame, but by terror itself. The final step? The sack was taken to the nearest river. Sometimes the Tiber, sometimes a far-off lake. Soldiers dragged it through the streets, deliberately, so the public could witness what became of traitors to family. Then came the silence. With a heave, the sack was tossed into the water. For a moment, it bobbed, heaving with violent struggle. Then it sank. The river absorbed it all. The fear, the madness, the judgment. It was execution by symbolism, death by ritual, a reverse birth, some historians say, sealing the criminal in a womb of leather, only to drown them, never to return. The Romans didn't use pena culiae often, because parricide itself was rare. But when they did, it served a chilling purpose. It told every Roman child, every disgruntled heir, every angry youth, there are boundaries that even the gods will not forgive you for crossing. And should you try, the law will not merely end your life. It will erase your legacy. Pena culiae wasn't just death, it was deletion. Punishment number 2. Acqui et ignis interdictio, banishment from water and fire. Imagine being stripped not only of your home, but of the very elements that make life possible. No water, no fire, No shelter. No society. In ancient Rome, this wasn't some cruel metaphor. It was legal punishment. It was called aquae et ignis interdictio, which translates directly to interdiction from water and fire. But its true meaning runs far deeper. Exile from civilization itself. This punishment was one of the most chilling in the Roman legal arsenal. Not because it involved physical pain, but because it removed everything that made someone Roman. It wasn't death by sword. It was death by absence. Let's break this down. The power of citizenship in ancient Rome. To understand the cruelty of this punishment, you first need to understand what it meant to be Roman. Citizenship wasn't just a passport or a label. It was a sacred status. It gave you rights. To own land, to marry legally, to vote, to appeal decisions in court. It gave you dignity. Even poor Romans held it dearer than gold. And perhaps most importantly, it gave you protection. So when Rome took that away, they weren't just exiling you physically. They were tearing out your identity, root and stem. What did aquae et ignis interdictio actually do? The punishment forbade the condemned person from using water or fire within the boundaries of Roman civilization. That may sound symbolic, but in practice, it meant you couldn't enter any city, town, or legally recognized settlement. Because every Roman town was legally and ritually founded on the availability of water and fire. These were the most basic human needs, and Rome regulated them with sacred care. So, if you were punished by interdiction from water and fire, the message was clear. You are no longer one of us. You're cast beyond the laws of man and God. You were expected to leave the Roman territory, now reduced to a wandering shadow. You had no family name, no access to temples, no protection from bandits. No one could house you. You were untouchable. Some would flee to the provinces. Others wandered the wilderness, hoping to survive on the edges of empire. And some, those with enemies in every direction, were hunted and killed. Who received this punishment? Aquae et ignis interdictio wasn't given for petty crimes. It was reserved for what the Romans called lesa majestas, or injured majesty, what we now call treason. But treason in Rome was a flexible term. It didn't always mean plotting to kill the emperor. It could mean insulting him, opposing his policies, even being too popular with the public. In other words, this punishment was a political sword. Senators, generals, poets, philosophers, none were safe. Even Cicero, one of the greatest orators Rome ever produced, was once condemned to this fate. In 58 BCE, after executing conspirators without trial, he was declared an enemy of the state and forced to flee. He was banned from Rome, and by extension, from the elements of life themselves. His houses were burned, his name scrubbed from records. And though he eventually returned, the trauma marked him forever. The theater of expulsion. Roman punishments weren't just about law. They were about drama. And aquae et ignis interdictio was no exception. Public pronouncements were made. Proclamations nailed to the forum walls. Sometimes the offender's home was razed, their statues pulled down, their family name cursed. Imagine waking up one morning and seeing your name scratched off every plaque. Your family's history vanished, and no one in the city willing to speak your name aloud for fear of sharing your fate. And then, you're told to go. Not in a week. Not tomorrow. Now. No time to gather belongings. No trial by peers. No final plea. You're marched to the city gate, handed a staff, and shoved into the wilderness. A walking ghost. The irony of mercy. Rome thought of this punishment as more merciful than execution. After all, you were still alive. But in practice, it could be worse than death. Exiled individuals often died in the wild, starved, or were enslaved in hostile territories. Some chose suicide over humiliation. Others tried to return in secret, only to be arrested and executed anyway. And many were never heard from again. But in the twisted logic of Roman justice, this slow, quiet erasure was a sign of the state's mercy. The idea was simple. You don't deserve our fire or our water. You don't deserve Rome. You're now beneath history. Weaponizing the law. As the empire grew and emperors took on more power, the punishment became more political. Emperors like Tiberius and Nero used it as a blunt instrument to silence opposition. Speak too freely? Interdicted. Disagree in public? Interdicted. And once you were gone, the emperor's scribes would rewrite the story to paint you as a traitor, a danger to the republic, an enemy of peace. Even after death, many exiles were denied burial in Roman land. Their bones lay in foreign soil, untended and unhonored. And in Rome, where funerals were sacred and the afterlife required remembrance, this was its own eternal sentence. A chilling legacy. Over time, the phrase interdiction from water and fire became shorthand for total social annihilation. It wasn't just being kicked out of town. It was a stripping of humanity. It meant you were unclean, a nothing, and the fear of it kept people in line. What's remarkable is how sophisticated this punishment was. Rome didn't always need to burn people alive or feed them to lions. Sometimes, it could just quietly turn its back. And that silence, that absence, was more terrifying than death itself. Modern echoes. When we think of exile today, we often imagine political dissidents or whistleblowers fleeing corrupt governments. But in Rome, it was the government itself that pushed people into the void. With words, with rituals, with cold, calculated indifference. Acqui et ignis interdictio reminds us that sometimes the most brutal punishments don't involve physical violence. Sometimes the worst thing a society can do is pretend you never existed. Final shot. The lonely Roman road again. The figure disappears into the horizon. Fade to black. Voiceover whisper. And so the fire goes out, and the water runs dry. Punishment number 3. Damnatio ad medullum. Condemnation to the mines. Beneath the marble temples and golden statues of Rome ran a hidden world. A world of darkness, dust, and despair. A place where light barely touched the walls, where men and women ceased to be citizens and became shadows. This was the fate of the condemned. Damnatio ad medullum. Condemnation to the mines. You see, Rome didn't always spill blood in the arena. Sometimes, it drained souls beneath the earth. What was damnatio ad medullum? Translated simply, damnatio ad medullum means condemnation to the metals. But this was far more than forced labor. It was a death sentence disguised as work. A slow death, earned not by a sword to the neck, but by years of agony, broken bones, suffocation, and madness. This punishment was often reserved for the worst criminals, murderers, thieves, traitors, but also for slaves, prisoners of war, and Christians. Once condemned, they were no longer people. They were tools. Tools to rip riches from the earth. And the mines of Rome? They were hell itself. The descent into the earth. Once sentenced, the condemned were shackled. Feet and sometimes even necks bound, and marched to mines scattered across the empire. Spain, Gaul, North Africa, Britain. Each mine had its own horrors. Some were open-air quarries, but the worst were underground death pits, where men dug for silver, lead, gold, copper, and iron. There was no ceremony, no final meal, no family farewell, just a gate that opened once and closed behind you forever. What life was like inside the mines. Calling it life is generous. The mines were cramped, often so narrow that workers had to crawl for hours in tunnels that twisted like veins. The air was thick with coal dust, metallic vapor, and poisonous gases. Ventilation barely existed. Fires smoldered to heat the rock. Then water was poured to crack the stone. But that only released more choking fumes. There was no silence. Day and night, men moaned, coughed, and screamed. Pickaxes rang against rock, the sound bouncing endlessly off the walls. The darkness was absolute. Lamps burned low, and many went blind from strain. Injuries were constant. Cuts, crushed bones, missing fingers. But there were no doctors here. Just filthy rags, if you were lucky. The worst part? Most were chained to their posts, sometimes for years, eating, sleeping, defecating in the same spot. Disease swept through constantly. Infections plague dysentery. If the mine didn't kill you, the sickness would. Why did Rome use this punishment? Simple. It was profitable. The empire needed materials: gold for coinage, iron for weapons, lead for pipes, marble for monuments. And forced labor provided a cost-free workforce that didn't need pay, food beyond survival, or moral concern. Damnatio ad metallum was economic punishment. Rome turned criminals into cogs in the machinery of empire. Your suffering became someone else's luxury. Somewhere above your head, a senator dined with golden forks, thanks to the blood you bled below the earth. The role of religion and slavery. By the 1st to 3rd century AD, Christianity was rising, and Rome saw it as a threat. Converts who refused to renounce their faith were often sentenced to the mines. Women, too, and children. The logic was twisted. If they wanted to suffer for their God, Rome would give them the ultimate suffering. Slaves also filled the mines, especially those who had rebelled, escaped, or disrespected their masters. To be sent to the mines was worse than the whip. It meant you had no worth, not even as property. Escaping the mines? Nearly impossible. Escape was unthinkable, not just because of the guards, but because the mines were often in remote, hostile terrain, surrounded by desert, mountains, or dense forests. And even if you managed to flee, where would you go? You were a fugitive. You wore chains. You were marked. Some tried. Most died before they ever saw sunlight. The psychological collapse. Damnatio ad metallum didn't just break the body. It shattered the mind. Men lost track of time. Some forgot their own names. Others started talking to rocks, singing to shadows, or banging their heads against the wall just to feel something real. The darkness took over. The smell. The weight of the earth above you. The hopelessness. Many begged to die. Some did. By suicide. Others by provoking guards. A quick execution was better than another year in the black abyss. Historical accounts and testimonies. Ancient writers didn't often describe the mines in detail. It was too shameful. But a few glimpses survive. Seneca the Younger referred to the fate of prisoners working without seeing the light of day, never standing straight, breathing poison with every breath. Pliny the Elder described the horrors of mercury mines in Spain, where the fumes alone can kill in a day. Even the great Christian martyr Saint Cyprian wrote of fellow Christians in the mines, their flesh torn, chained like animals, stripped of all dignity, yet still praying. A cruel form of silence. Perhaps the most terrifying part? The world above often forgot about them. Once sentenced, your name disappeared. There were no grave markers, no records, no prayers, no tombs. The mine swallowed you whole, body, mind, and legacy. Families rarely dared speak your name. The shame was too great. Your death was not noble. It was profitable, quiet, unwitnessed, and Rome liked it that way. A system that fed itself. The success of Roman construction, coinage, weapons, all of it, was built on the backs of men who died underground. Every time a new temple rose in marble, a dozen slaves had died extracting the stone. Every shiny coin passed in the marketplace, it cost someone their lungs. Rome expanded not just with armies, but with chains. The mines were not a sideshow. They were a pillar of the empire. The end of the mines. Over time, as the empire weakened and moral values shifted, damnatio ad medullum declined. Christianity, once persecuted, became the state religion. The cruelty of the mines was no longer justifiable, at least not in the same scale. But by then, tens of thousands had already perished. Legacy and reflection. Today, we still talk about breaking rocks in the hot sun. We imagine punishment as labor. But what Rome did in those mines was something darker. It reduced life to utility. It turned punishment into industry. Damnatio ad medullum wasn't meant to reform or execute. It was meant to use you until you were used up. And when your body finally gave out, it was dumped into a shaft, unmarked, forgotten. Crucifixion. The very word today sends shivers down our spine. A symbol of pain, suffering, and public humiliation. But in ancient Rome, it was more than just a death sentence. It was a statement. A brutal, prolonged message carved not just into flesh, but into memory. Rome didn't invent crucifixion, but they perfected it, made it colder, crueler, purpose-built to maximize suffering, and to terrify all who looked upon it. It wasn't just about ending a life. It was about erasing a person slowly, painfully, and in full view of the world. Who was crucified? Crucifixion was never for Roman citizens. Unless they had committed treason, it was reserved for the lowest of the low. Slaves, rebels, deserters, pirates, and especially those who challenged the authority of Rome. And when Rome felt particularly threatened, as in the case of revolts or mass uprisings, it used crucifixion en masse. Thousands could be hung at once, lining roads and hillsides like grotesque scarecrows of empire. The most infamous example, after the failed slave rebellion led by Spartacus in 71 BCE, 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, stretching for over 100 miles. A forest of agony, a message carved into every horizon. Never challenge Rome. The process, from sentence to cross. The journey to crucifixion often began with a scourging, a flogging with a flagrum, a short whip with pieces of bone or metal woven into its cords. This alone could kill a man. It ripped skin, muscle, and pride. It was meant to weaken the condemned before the final ordeal. Then came the cross. Contrary to popular imagery, the condemned often carried only the horizontal beam, the patibulum, to the execution site. The vertical stake might already be in the ground, reused for multiple victims. The procession was public. Guards marched the victim through busy streets. People jeered. Some threw stones. A sign was hung around the condemned's neck, listing their crime in bold black letters. Humiliation was part of the punishment. Once at the site, the man was stripped naked. No dignity, no loincloth. Then came the nails. Nails were often driven through the wrists, not the palms, to bear the body's weight. Feet were either nailed together or on opposite sides of the upright beam. Sometimes, a small wooden support called a sedile was added beneath the victim's buttocks, not to offer relief, but to prolong the agony. The goal was not to kill quickly. The goal was to kill slowly. The agony on the cross. Crucifixion was a medical nightmare. Victims often lasted hours, even days, suspended in excruciating pain. Every breath became a struggle. Hanging by your arms forces the diaphragm to tighten, making exhaling difficult. To breathe, the victim had to push up with their feet, rubbing open wounds against rough wood, just to gasp for air. Cramping, fever, flies, exposure, dehydration, loss of blood, all added to the torment. Birds sometimes landed on the motionless bodies, pecking at eyes or open wounds. And yet death often didn't come from blood loss. It came from suffocation, cardiac arrest, or simply the body giving out from trauma and exhaustion. A tool of fear and control. Why did Rome use crucifixion? Not because it was efficient, but because it was terrifying. It made a spectacle of suffering. It turned executions into public warnings. People walked by and remembered. Children asked their parents, "What did he do?" And the answer always served the state. He disobeyed. He rebelled. He threatened the peace. The crucified were not just punished. They were displayed, often left hanging for days, until birds, dogs, or rot consumed them. Burial was sometimes denied. In Roman culture, to be unburied was to be dishonored forever. Crucifixion of Jesus. One among many. Though famous for the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, Rome crucified tens of thousands. His death became globally symbolic, but in the Roman world, he was just another day's sentence. This tells us something chilling. Even the most iconic crucifixion in history was considered routine to the empire. The end of crucifixion. As Christianity spread, crucifixion became morally and spiritually repugnant to many Romans. It symbolized the brutality of the past, and eventually, under Emperor Constantine in the 4th century AD, it was officially banned. But by then, the cross had already become a symbol, not of Rome's power, but of human suffering, injustice, and the capacity for endurance under unimaginable pain. Legacy. Crucifixion is more than a historical method of execution. It is a window into the soul of an empire. It shows us how Rome understood justice, fear, and obedience. To be crucified was to die in agony, to die in shame, to be made into a warning. And in that sense, crucifixion worked exactly as Rome intended.